Stop right there, you thief. Drop the stolen property, and put your hands where I can see them. That's what 4 police officers shouted at me while I was literally moving my late uncle's antique plow into the barn on my own ranch. The HOA president stood behind them with her phone out, recording everything like she'd just caught America's most wanted red-handed. The craziest part was she'd reported me for stealing property that had been in my family for 3 generations. Property that sat on land I legally owned, and she had zero authority over. I wasn't even part of their precious homeowners association, but somehow this power-drunk woman thought she could have me arrested for theft on my own property. Ever had someone accuse you of stealing your own stuff? Drop your wildest false accusation story in the comments below. I read every single one. My name is Jackson Rivers, and 6 months ago I inherited my uncle Theodore's 25-acre ranch after he passed away from a heart attack. I'd been working as an antique appraiser and historical consultant in Denver, dealing with estate sales and museum acquisitions, when the lawyer called to tell me Uncle Ted had left me everything. The ranch sat on the outskirts of Pine Valley, Colorado, a place that used to be pure farmland, until developers started creeping in about 5 years ago. Uncle Ted had been more than just family to me. He'd been my mentor in understanding the value of historical preservation. Every summer growing up, I'd spend weeks at his ranch learning about the antique farming equipment. He collected the stories behind each piece and how they represented Colorado's agricultural heritage. The man had turned his property into an unofficial museum of farming history, with pieces dating back to the 1800s. The ranch itself was a beautiful sprawl of land with a main house built in 1922, a massive barn that housed Uncle Ted's collection, and several outbuildings filled with everything from vintage tractors to hand-forged tools. Some of the equipment was legitimately museum quality, including an 1860 John Deere plow that historians had valued at over $50,000, and a collection of blacksmith tools from the original homesteaders. About 3 years ago, a development called Mountain Vista Estates went up about a quarter-mile from the ranch's eastern border. Cookie-cutter McMansions with fake stone facades and 3-car garages, all governed by what I would soon learn was one of the most aggressive homeowners associations in the state. At first, the development didn't affect the ranch much. We were far enough away that their manufactured perfection didn't clash too badly with our authentic, rustic setup. I'd been living on the ranch for about 2 months, getting settled and cataloging Uncle Ted's collection when I first encountered Brenda Hawthorne. She showed up at my gate one Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. in a spotless white Range Rover that probably cost more than most people's houses. She was in her early 50s with platinum blonde hair, styled like she was heading to a country club luncheon, wearing designer jeans that had never seen actual work, and carrying a leather portfolio that screamed expensive. "Mr. Rivers, I presume," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Brenda Hawthorne, president of the Mountain Vista Estates Homeowners Association, and I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." She said neighborhood. Like my ranch was just another lot in her development, rather than a property that had existed decades before her. McMansions were even a thought. "Thanks for stopping by," I said politely, though something about her energy immediately put me on edge. "Though technically I'm not really in your neighborhood, I'm about a quarter-mile outside your development." Her smile tightened, and she opened her portfolio, pulling out a stack of papers covered in highlighting and sticky notes. "Well, that's actually what I wanted to discuss with you, Mr. Rivers. Your property's proximity to our community means that your activities directly impact our residents' quality of life." She launched into a prepared speech about property values, community standards, and the importance of maintaining a certain aesthetic in the area. According to her, my ranch with its weathered barn antique equipment and actual working aspects was bringing down property values and creating an eyesore for Mountain Vista residents. She actually used the word eyesore while looking at my 1800s barn like it was a pile of garbage rather than a historical structure. "I appreciate your concerns, Miss Hawthorne, but this ranch has been here since 1922, I explained, trying to keep my tone civil. "Everything on this property is legal, and honestly your development is the new addition to this area, not the other way around." Her face flushed slightly, but she maintained her fake professional demeanor. "Be that as it may, Mr. Rivers, we have certain expectations for properties in our vicinity. I noticed you have quite a collection of old equipment scattered around. Perhaps you'd consider removing some of the more visible pieces." That's when I realized she had no idea what she was looking at. The Old equipment scattered around included museum-quality artifacts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, pieces that Uncle Ted had spent decades collecting and preserving. But to her, they were just junk, bringing down her precious property values. "That equipment represents 3 generations of Colorado farming history," I said, my patience starting to wear thin. "It's not junk, it's a collection of historical artifacts, some of which are literally priceless." She made a dismissive sound that reminded me of every entitled person I'd ever dealt with in the antique business. "Well, perhaps you could store them somewhere less visible. We have potential buyers touring the area, and frankly, your display is concerning." After she left, I thought that would be the end of it. Just another nosy neighbor who didn't understand the value of historical preservation. I had no idea that Brenda Hawthorne was about to launch a campaign that would make my life a living hell, all because she couldn't stand the sight of authentic history next to her fake luxury development. The first sign of escalation came about a week later, when I found orange survey flags planted along my property line. They were the kind surveyors use, but something about their placement seemed off, like someone was trying to redefine where my property ended and the public road began. I pulled them up and tossed them aside, figuring someone had made a mistake. That same afternoon, my nearest neighbor Sam Chen stopped by. Sam owned a small organic farm about half a mile down the road and had been friends with Uncle Ted for years. He was a straight shooter in his 60s who didn't mince words about anything. "Jackson, you need to watch out for that Hawthorne woman," he warned, accepting the beer I offered him. "She's been causing problems for every property owner who doesn't fit her vision of what this area should look. Like she ran the Hendersons off last year with constant complaints and legal threats." "Legal threats for what?" I asked, though I was already getting a bad feeling about where this was going. "Anything she could think of," Sam shook his head. "Noise complaints, zoning violations, false reports about environmental hazards. She even tried to claim their goat farm was a health risk to her precious community. The Hendersons finally sold just to get away from the harassment." He told me about 2 other families who'd been driven off by Brenda's tactics, always property owners who'd been there before Mountain Vista Estates existed. It was becoming clear that she had a pattern of targeting anyone whose property didn't match her suburban aesthetic. "The thing is, she's got connections," Sam continued. "Her husband Robert is a big-shot lawyer who handles real estate law, and their son works for the county planning department. Between the 3 of them, they can make your life pretty miserable." The harassment started small at first. I'd find more survey flags mysteriously appearing overnight. Then came the anonymous complaints to the county about everything from noise that didn't exist to claims that my antique equipment was creating environmental hazards. Each complaint required me to take time off from cataloging the collection to deal with inspectors who always found nothing wrong but still had to do their due diligence. Then things got weird. I started noticing that pieces of equipment would be moved slightly overnight. Nothing major, just enough to let me know someone had been on my property. A vintage cultivator that had been facing north would be turned to face south. Wooden crates of tools would be rearranged. It was like someone was cataloging my collection without permission. I installed security cameras after the 3rd incident of equipment being disturbed. The footage I captured was shocking. At 2:17 a.m., Brenda Hawthorne herself was on my property with 2 other people, taking photos of every piece of equipment, making notes, and even attempting to look for serial numbers or identifying marks. They spent over an hour documenting my collection like they were building some kind of case. The next morning I drove to the Mountain Vista Estates clubhouse to confront her. The development was everything you'd expect from new money, suburbia, perfect lawns, maintained by crews of workers, identical mailboxes, and houses that tried so hard to look expensive, they ended up looking cheap. The clubhouse was a monument to faux luxury, with fake marble columns and a fountain that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. I found Brenda in her office surrounded by binders, labeled with things like community standards and violation documentation. She didn't even try to deny being on my property when I confronted her about the plane. "Security footage. I was conducting a community safety assessment," she said with that same fake smile. "We've received reports that some of your equipment might be stolen property, and I felt it was my duty to investigate." Stolen property. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That equipment has been in my family for generations. I have documentation for every single piece." "Do you, though?" she asked, leaning back in her chair like she held all the cards. "Because I've been doing some research, Mr. Rivers, and it." Seems very convenient that you suddenly inherited all these valuable antiques from an uncle who lived alone with no other family to verify your claims. The implication hit me like a slap in the face. She was suggesting that I had somehow fabricated my inheritance, or worse, that I had something to do with Uncle Ted's death. The accusation was so outrageous that for a moment I couldn't even form words to respond. You need to be very careful about what you're implying. I finally managed my voice low and controlled despite the rage building inside me. My uncle's death was natural causes confirmed by the medical examiner, and my inheritance is completely legal with documentation filed at the county courthouse. Of course, she said, waving her hand dismissively. I'm not implying anything illegal, Mr. Rivers. I'm simply pointing out that when someone suddenly appears with a collection of valuable antiques claiming inheritance, well, it raises questions, especially when that collection is creating problems for our community. I left her office, knowing that this was far from over. Brenda Hawthorne had declared war, and she was using the one weapon she thought would work, suggesting that my legitimate inheritance was somehow illegal. What she didn't know was that I had spent years in the antique business, dealing with provenance documentation, authentication, and legal ownership. If she wanted to play games with property rights, she had picked the wrong person. The situation exploded exactly 1 week later. I was in the barn moving the 1860 John Deere plow to a better display position when I heard multiple vehicles speeding up my driveway. Through the barn door, I could see 4 police cruisers kicking up dust as they surrounded the entrance. Officers jumped out with hands on their weapons approaching, like they were responding to an active crime scene. "Drop the stolen property and step away from the equipment," one officer shouted, his hand hovering over his service weapon. "Keep your hands where we can see them." I carefully set down the plow tongue I'd been adjusting and raised my hands, completely bewildered by what was happening. "Officers, there must be some mistake. I'm the property owner. I'm just organizing my collection." "We received a report of active theft in progress," the lead officer said, maintaining his defensive stance. "Multiple stolen historical artifacts being moved for illegal sale." That's when I saw her, Brenda Hawthorne, standing behind the police cars with her phone out, recording everything. She had 2 other HOA board members with her, all filming what they clearly thought was going to be my arrest for theft. The satisfaction on her face made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Officers, I'm Jackson Rivers. I own this ranch and everything on it," I said slowly and clearly. "My uncle Theodore Rivers left me this property and his entire collection when he passed away 6 months ago. I have all the documentation inside the house." "Ma'am, you reported seeing stolen property being moved," one officer asked Brenda, who stepped forward with theatrical concern. "Yes, officer. I've documented numerous pieces of historical equipment that rightfully belong to the Pine Valley Historical Society being hoarded on this property," she said loud enough for her camera to pick up clearly. "Mr. Rivers claims he inherited them, but the Historical Society has no record of these items being legally transferred to private ownership." The lie was so bold, so calculated, that I actually laughed out loud, which probably didn't help my situation. The Pine Valley Historical Society had never owned any of Uncle Ted's collection. In fact, they had tried to buy several pieces from him over the years, and he had always refused, preferring to maintain his private museum. "That's completely false," I said firmly. "The Historical Society has never owned any of this equipment. My uncle collected these pieces over 40 years, purchasing them from farms, estate sales, and private collectors. Have receipts, documentation, and provenance for every single item." The lead officer looked between Brenda and me, clearly trying to assess the situation. "Sir, do you have documentation readily available that proves ownership?" "Everything is in my office in the house," I replied, "including the will that specifically bequeaths the entire collection to me, insurance appraisals from certified historians, and purchase records going back decades." The officers relaxed slightly, but maintained their professional stance. "We'll need to see that documentation, sir. This is a serious allegation." As we walked toward the house with Brenda and her crew, following like vultures, I couldn't help but notice how she kept whispering to her companions, making sure they were getting every angle. This wasn't just about harassment anymore. She was trying to publicly destroy me, create a narrative that I was a thief who had stolen valuable historical artifacts. Inside my uncle's meticulously organized office, I pulled out binder after binder of documentation. Uncle Ted had been almost obsessive about keeping records, knowing the value of what he was collecting. There were receipts, purchase agreements, certificates of authenticity, and detailed provenance records for every major piece. The crown jewel was a notarized inventory, completed just 2 months before his death, listing every item in the collection and specifically stating his intention to leave it all to me. The lead officer reviewed the documents carefully while Brenda grew increasingly agitated behind him. These could all be forged, she insisted. Anyone with basic computer skills could create fake receipts. Ma'am, are you seriously suggesting that 40 years of documentation has been forged? The officer asked his patients, clearly wearing thin. These receipts include carbon copies, bank records, and notarized statements from multiple witnesses. Plus, I added, pulling out my trump card, here's the insurance appraisal conducted by Wellington Auction House last year. They're one of the most respected antique appraisers in the country. They verified and documented every piece in the collection for insurance purposes. The officer spent another 10 minutes reviewing documents before finally turning to Brenda. Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious offense. This gentleman has provided extensive documentation proving legal ownership of everything on this property. But the Historical Society. Brenda started, but the officer cut her off. Has no claim to this property or collection based on what I'm seeing here, he said firmly. Mr. Rivers, I apologize for the confusion. We'll be leaving now. As the police prepared to leave, I made a decision that would change everything. Officers, before you go, I'd like to file a complaint for harassment, trespassing, and filing a false police report. I pulled out my phone, showing them the security footage. This woman has been entering my property at night, documenting my possessions, and has now made false accusations that resulted in an unwarranted police response. The lead officer's expression hardened as he watched the footage of Brenda sneaking around my property at 2 in the morning. Mr. Rivers, would you like to press charges? Yes, I said without hesitation. I absolutely would. Brenda's face went from smug satisfaction to shock in seconds. You can't be serious. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association. I was protecting our community. From what exactly? I asked. From historical preservation, from legally owned property, from someone who has every right to live peacefully on their own land. As the officers took Brenda's information and explained that she would need to come to the station for formal charging, her 2 companions quickly stopped recording and tried to distance themselves from the situation. The shift in power dynamics was immediate and dramatic. But I knew this wasn't over. Brenda Hawthorne didn't become HOA president by giving up easily, and the fury in her eyes as the police escorted her to her Range Rover told me she was going to escalate this war to a whole new level. What I didn't know yet was just how far she was willing to go or what she was really after. That evening, as I sat on my porch looking out at Uncle Ted's collection bathed in the golden light of sunset, I pulled out his journal. He'd kept detailed notes about everything, including his interactions with neighbors. What I found in those pages made everything suddenly make sense, and revealed that this conflict was about much more than just property values or HOA power trips. Uncle Ted's journal entry from 3 years ago made my blood run cold. Robert Hawthorne visited again today, claiming his client wants to buy the ranch for development. Offered $2 million cash. When I refused, he mentioned that the 1860 plow and the complete Studebaker collection would be worth more to the right collector. How did he know about the Studebaker pieces in the sealed storage building? Someone has been providing him detailed information about my collection. He said his client could make things difficult if I didn't sell. I told him to get off my property. I flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry documenting the Hawthornes' attempts to buy the ranch. The offers had increased over time, reaching $5 million just 6 months before Uncle Ted's death. Each time he refused, the pressure tactics got worse. Anonymous complaints, false code violations, and even attempts to have the property condemned. But the most disturbing entry was from just 2 weeks before his heart attack. Brenda Hawthorne showed up today with a full camera crew claiming to be documenting historical properties for a television show. I refused to let them on the property, but caught them flying a drone over the back storage buildings. They know about the complete collection, now including the items in climate-controlled storage. Robert called an hour later, saying their client was prepared to offer $8 million, but this was the final offer. When I said no, he said I was a foolish old man who didn't know what was good for him. The way he said it felt like a threat. I set the journal down and walked to the window looking out at the storage buildings Uncle Ted had mentioned. I knew there were 3 climate-controlled units behind the main barn, but I hadn't fully cataloged their contents yet, focusing instead on the main collection. If someone was willing to pay $8 million for the property, there had to be more here than just valuable antiques. The next morning I decided to thoroughly investigate the storage buildings. The first 2 contained exactly what I expected: more farming equipment, including a pristine 1895 Studebaker wagon and several pieces from the early 1900s. But the third building held a surprise that explained everything. Inside, carefully preserved and documented, was a complete 1889 Studebaker President's carriage, one of only 3 known to exist. Uncle Ted had notes indicating it had belonged to President Benjamin Harrison and included documentation from the Smithsonian authenticating its provenance. The carriage alone was worth an estimated $12 million. But that wasn't all. The building also contained a collection of Civil War-era military equipment that had belonged to a Colorado cavalry unit, including saddles, weapons, and uniforms, all in remarkable condition. I was photographing everything when my phone rang. It was my lawyer, Marcus Webb, calling with urgent news. "Jackson, you need to know that Brenda Hawthorne has filed a civil lawsuit claiming adverse possession of a portion of your property. She says the HOA has been maintaining a strip of land along your eastern border for 5 years, therefore has legal claim to it." "That's ridiculous," I said, already knowing which piece of land she meant. "That strip includes the access road to the back storage buildings. She's trying to landlock those buildings so I can't move anything in or out." "It gets worse," Marcus continued. "She's also filed a petition with the Historical Society, claiming that your uncle's collection should be considered community heritage and prevented from being sold or moved pending a full review. She's trying to tie up the estate in legal red tape." I hung up knowing I needed to act fast. Brenda wasn't just some power-hungry HOA president. She was working with someone who knew exactly what was in Uncle Ted's collection and was systematically trying to steal it through legal manipulation. But she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated who she was dealing with. That afternoon I drove to Denver to meet with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the director of the Colorado Historical Museum and one of my professional contacts from my years in the antique appraisal business. Sarah had been trying to acquire pieces from Uncle Ted's collection for years, and knew its true value better than anyone. "Jackson, I heard about your uncle. I'm so sorry for your loss," Sarah said as we sat in her office surrounded by Colorado historical artifacts. "Ted was one of the most important private collectors in the state. What he preserved is irreplaceable." I explained the situation with Brenda and the HOA, and Sarah's expression grew increasingly angry as I talked. "That woman has been a plague on historical preservation," she said finally. "Do you know she tried to have the Henderson farm bulldozed last year? It had a barn from 1872 that we were trying to get designated as a historical landmark, but she claimed it was a safety hazard and got it condemned before we could act." "She seems to have a pattern," I agreed. "But this time she's gone too far. She's trying to steal a collection worth over $20 million. And she's using her position as HOA president to do it." Sarah leaned forward with interest. $20 million. I knew Ted had valuable pieces, but that seems high even for his collection. I showed her the photos of the president's carriage and the Civil War collection, and her eyes went wide. "My God, Jackson, do you realize what you have here? That carriage belongs in a museum. It's a piece of American history." "I know," I said, "and I'm willing to donate it to the museum, but first I need to stop Brenda from stealing it through legal tricks. Can the museum help?" Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "Oh, I think we can do better than help. I think we can end Mrs. Hawthorne's career of destroying historical properties once and for all. Let me make some calls." By the time I left Sarah's office, a plan was forming. The Colorado Historical Museum was prepared to get involved not just to protect Uncle Ted's collection, but to expose Brenda's pattern of targeting historical properties for destruction. But I needed more evidence of her actual intentions, and that meant playing a dangerous game. I returned to the ranch to find several vehicles parked along my property line, including a van marked Mountain Vista Security and Brenda's white Range Rover. She was standing at my gate with 3 security guards and 2 other HOA board members holding official-looking documents. "Mr. Rivers," she called out as I stopped at the gate. I'm here to inform you that the HOA has voted to enforce community standards on all adjacent properties effective immediately. You have 48 hours to remove all unsightly equipment from view or face legal action. I got out of my truck staying calm despite my anger. You have no authority over my property. Brenda, we've been through this. The police have been through this. You need to leave. Actually, she said with that smug smile, our lawyer has found some very interesting precedents about community standards and adjacent property rights. You'd be surprised what a motivated legal team can accomplish. One of her security guards was filming the entire exchange, while another was taking photos of my property from the road. I noticed they were particularly focused on the storage buildings in the back, almost like they were documenting their exact locations. Tell me something, Brenda, I said casually. How much is your client paying you to harass me into selling, or is it a percentage of what they expect to make from stealing my uncle's collection? Her smile faltered for just a second before returning full force. I have no idea what you're talking about, Mr. Rivers. I'm simply doing my job as HOA president to maintain property values. Right, I said, pulling out my phone. Well, since you're so concerned about documentation, I should let you know I'm recording this interaction for my own legal protection, and I have a question. How did your husband know about the Studebaker collection in the back storage buildings when he visited my uncle 3 years ago? The color drained from her face. I don't know what you mean. Really, because I have my uncle's journal documenting every visit, every threat, every attempt to force him to sell, including your husband mentioning specific pieces that weren't visible from any public area, almost like someone had been trespassing and documenting the collection illegally. You can't prove anything, she snapped, abandoning her fake pleasant demeanor. Your uncle was a paranoid old man who made up stories. Maybe, I said, or maybe I have security footage from 3 years ago that Uncle Ted saved showing certain people sneaking around his property at night with cameras, or maybe I have recordings of phone calls where your husband threatened him, or maybe I have evidence that you've been running this same scam on multiple properties using your HOA position to force sales to mysterious clients. I was bluffing about some of it, but her reaction told me I was on the right track. She gestured frantically to her security team. We're leaving, but this isn't over. Rivers, you have 48 hours to comply with community standards or face the consequences. As they drove away, I knew the clock was ticking. Brenda and whoever was backing her were going to make their move soon, and I needed to be ready. I spent the rest of the day implementing security measures, including new cameras, motion sensors, and even hiring a private security firm to patrol the property at night. That evening, Marcus called with disturbing news. Jackson, I just got word that Robert Hawthorne has filed an emergency injunction, claiming that you're planning to illegally remove historical artifacts from the property. They're trying to get a judge to freeze all your assets, including the collection, until their civil suit is resolved. How can they do that? I asked, though I was already mentally preparing for the legal battle. They're claiming that since the HOA has been maintaining that strip of land, they have a vested interest in preserving access to what they call community historical resources, Marcus explained. It's complete nonsense. But if they get the right judge, it could tie things up for months. I hung up and made a decision. If Brenda wanted to play dirty, I was going to show her what happened when you messed with someone who understood both the law and the value of documentation. I called Sarah Mitchell and told her it was time to accelerate our plan. The next morning brought chaos. Process servers showed up at 7 a.m. with legal documents, while news vans pulled up to film what Brenda had apparently told them would be a major HOA victory against an illegal antiquities dealer. She had orchestrated a media circus designed to pressure me into submission, but I was ready. As the process server handed me the papers, I smiled and handed him papers of my own. Please deliver this to Mrs. Hawthorne, I said loudly enough for the news cameras to pick up. It's a cease and desist order plus a lawsuit for defamation, harassment, and attempted grand theft. The reporter's interest shifted immediately. Sir, can you explain what's happening here? I had prepared for this moment. Certainly. For the past several months, HOA President Brenda Hawthorne has been conducting a harassment campaign, trying to force me to sell my inherited property to unnamed developers. When I refused, she escalated to false police reports, trespassing, and now fraudulent legal claims. What she doesn't want you to know is that this is part of a pattern where she's forced multiple historical property owners to sell under duress. That's a lie, Brenda shouted, pushing her way to the front. This man is hoarding stolen historical artifacts that belong to the community. Really? I said, pulling out a folder. Then how do you explain these documents showing that your husband's law firm represents Pinnacle Development Group, the same company that bought the Henderson farm after you had their historical barn condemned the Martinez property, after you forced them out with false code violations, and the Chen Heritage Site that mysteriously burned down after they refused to sell? The reporters turned their cameras on Brenda, who was stammering about coincidences and community improvement, but I wasn't done. Sarah Mitchell arrived with a team from the Colorado Historical Museum, including their legal counsel and a documentary crew. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Sarah announced as the news cameras swiveled to her, "the Colorado Historical Museum has launched an investigation into your systematic targeting of historical properties for destruction. We have evidence that you've been working with developers to identify valuable historical sites, force owners to sell through harassment, and then destroy irreplaceable artifacts for profit. Furthermore," the museum's lawyer added, "we've filed criminal charges for conspiracy to commit grand theft, attempted theft of cultural artifacts, and racketeering. The FBI's art crime team has been notified about your attempts to steal the Harrison presidential carriage." The mention of the FBI made everyone, including the reporters, take a step back. Brenda's face went from red to white as the implications hit her. This wasn't just about HOA violations anymore, this was about federal crimes. "You can't prove anything," she said, but her voice was shaking. "I'm just trying to protect property values." "Actually, we can prove everything," I said, pulling out my phone, "including this recording of your husband from 3 years ago, telling my uncle that he knew about items in locked storage buildings, items that could only be documented through illegal trespassing. And these photos from your computer showing detailed inventories of not just my property but 6 other historical sites that were mysteriously forced to sell over the past 5 years. How did you get into my computer?" she shrieked, confirming that the photos were real. "I didn't," I said calmly. "Your son Bradley did when he discovered what you were really doing. He came to me yesterday with everything, emails, contracts with Pinnacle Development Group, even recordings of you discussing how to force my uncle to sell by making his life miserable. This was the killing blow. Bradley Hawthorne had discovered his parents were criminals and had chosen to do the right thing. He was waiting in my truck ready to testify about everything he'd witnessed over the years." The news reporters were frantically taking notes and asking questions, while Brenda tried to maintain her composure. But when 2 FBI agents arrived to question her about the attempted theft of federal heritage items, she finally broke. "It wasn't my idea," she screamed, pointing at her husband who had just arrived. "Robert set everything up," he said. "We could make millions by forcing these old farmers to sell. He said no one would care about some rusty old equipment." Robert Hawthorne tried to run but didn't get far. The FBI agents were quite interested in talking to him about conspiracy to steal items of national historical significance. As they led both Hawthornes away in handcuffs, the reporters turned back to me for comment. "Mr. Rivers, what's going to happen to your uncle's collection now?" one asked. I looked at Sarah Mitchell and smiled. "The presidential carriage and several other pieces of national significance will be donated to the Colorado Historical Museum where they belong. The rest of the collection will remain here, as Uncle Ted wanted, turned into a proper museum, so people can learn about Colorado's agricultural heritage. And as for the HOA, well, I think Mountain Vista Estates is about to get new leadership that actually cares about the community instead of destroying it." The aftermath was swift and satisfying. The Hawthornes were charged with multiple federal crimes, including racketeering, conspiracy, and attempted theft of cultural artifacts. The investigation revealed they had stolen or destroyed over $50 million worth of historical items over 5 years, always using Brenda's HOA position to force sales. Pinnacle Development Group was shut down, and its executives arrested when investigators found warehouses full of stolen historical items waiting to be sold on the black market. Apparently, the company specialized in identifying valuable collections, forcing sales through harassment, and then selling the items to private collectors overseas. Mountain Vista Estates held an emergency election and removed the entire HOA board, replacing them with people who actually lived in the community and cared about their neighbors. The new president, Sandra Williams, came to apologize personally for everything I'd endured. "We had no idea what she was really doing," Sandra said, as we stood in front of the barn. "Most of us just wanted a nice place to live. We didn't sign up for criminal conspiracies. I accepted her apology and even invited the HOA members to tour the collection once the museum was set up. Building bridges with the community seemed like what Uncle Ted would have wanted, even if their former president had tried to destroy everything he'd built. Bradley Hawthorne became a key witness in his parents' trial. It turned out he'd been suspicious for years, but the final straw was when he overheard them discussing having me arrested on false charges. He'd spent weeks gathering evidence before coming to me, knowing it would destroy his family but unable to live with what they were doing. "My parents raised me to do the right thing," he told me after the trial. "I guess they didn't expect me to apply that to them." I hired Bradley to help run the museum. He needed a fresh start away from his family's crimes, and he had a genuine interest in historical preservation. Sometimes good people come from bad circumstances, and everyone deserves a chance at redemption. The museum opened 6 months later with Sarah Mitchell cutting the ribbon. We'd restored the barn, added climate-controlled display areas, and created educational programs for local schools. The presidential carriage had its own special exhibit, and thousands of people came to see it in the first month alone. But the best part was the wall of photos, showing Uncle Ted with his collection over the years. His dream of preserving Colorado's agricultural heritage had not only survived, but thrived, despite the attempts to destroy it. The museum's mission statement included his own words about the importance of remembering where we came from. I kept the ranch house as my private residence, but opened the grounds for tours and educational events. School kids came to learn about farming history. Historians studied the collection, and families enjoyed picnics while exploring exhibits. It was exactly what Uncle Ted had envisioned, a place where history lived and breathed, instead of being locked away or destroyed. The Hawthornes were both sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for their crimes. During the sentencing, Brenda tried to claim she was just protecting property values, but the judge wasn't buying it. He called her actions a betrayal of public trust and an assault on American heritage. Robert lost his law license, and their assets were seized to pay restitution to their victims. The families they'd forced out received compensation, and several were able to buy back their properties. The Henderson barn was gone forever, but at least some justice was served. 1 year after that insane morning when police surrounded me for stealing my own property, I stood in the museum talking to a group of third graders about the 1860 plow. They were fascinated by how it worked, and why it was important, asking the kind of questions that made teaching worthwhile. "Mr. Rivers," one little girl asked, "why did that mean lady try to steal your uncle's stuff?" I thought about how to explain greed and corruption to an 8-year-old. "Sometimes people forget that money isn't everything," I said finally. "They think being rich is more important than doing what's right, but your uncle taught me that protecting history and helping others learn is worth more than any amount of money." The kids nodded solemnly, like I'd shared some great wisdom. Maybe I had. Uncle Ted's journal sat in a place of honor in the museum, with his own words visible to everyone who entered. History isn't just about objects, it's about the stories they tell and the lessons they teach. Preserve the past to enlighten the future. Sam Chen still farms down the road and stops by regularly to share stories about Uncle Ted. He loves telling visitors about the time Ted chased off developers with an antique shotgun that wasn't even loaded, just to make a point about standing your ground. "Your uncle would be proud," Sam told me one afternoon as we watched families exploring the museum. "He always said this collection needed to be shared, not hoarded, and you've done exactly that." The ranch has become a destination for people interested in agricultural history, artifact preservation, and the fight against development corruption. Documentary filmmakers have featured our story as an example of how communities can fight back against those who would destroy heritage for profit. But for me, the best moments are the quiet ones. Early mornings, when I walk through the exhibits, remembering Uncle Ted teaching me about each piece. Evenings on the porch looking out at the land 3 generations of my family fought to protect. The knowledge that his legacy lives on not just in objects but in education and inspiration. Sometimes I think about how different things might have been if I'd just sold when Brenda first started her harassment campaign. The money would have been nice and I could have avoided a lot of stress. But then thousands of people wouldn't have learned about Colorado's agricultural heritage, kids wouldn't have hands-on experiences with historical artifacts, and criminals who destroyed so much history would still be operating. Standing up to bullies isn't easy, especially when they have power connections and no moral boundaries. But sometimes one person refusing to back down can expose corruption that's been hidden for years. Sometimes protecting what matters means fighting, even when the odds seem impossible. The museum's guest book fills with comments from visitors grateful for the chance to see history preserved and presented with love. Former victims of the Hawthorne schemes come to share their own stories, finding healing in seeing justice served. Students write essays about their visits, and teachers build curricula around our exhibits. Uncle Ted's collection has become more than just artifacts. It's become a symbol of resistance against those who would destroy the past for profit. Every preserved plow, every restored wagon, every carefully maintained piece of equipment stands as defiance against people like Brenda Hawthorne, who see only dollar signs where others see heritage. On quiet evenings, I sometimes find myself in the storage building where the presidential carriage once sat, now empty, except for maintenance equipment. I think about that morning when 4 police officers surrounded me, when Brenda thought she'd won, when everything could have gone differently, but it didn't. Truth won. Justice prevailed. And a bitter woman who built her power on destroying others' dreams learned that sometimes the person you're trying to crush knows exactly how to fight back. Her HOA presidency, her husband's law practice, their son's trust, everything they'd built on lies came crashing down because they picked the wrong target. The ranch still sits exactly where it always has, weathered barn and all, but now, instead of being an eyesore to entitled suburbanites, it's a beacon of historical preservation. Instead of rusty old equipment, it houses treasures of American heritage. Instead of one old man fighting alone, it's protected by an entire community that understands its value. I still have the security footage of Brenda sneaking around the property at 2 a.m., documenting what she thought would be her biggest score. Sometimes I watch it and laugh at the irony. She spent so much time and effort trying to steal what Uncle Ted had already planned to share with the world. If she'd just been a decent neighbor, she could have enjoyed the museum like everyone else. But people like Brenda don't understand that. They see kindness as weakness, preservation as hoarding, and community as something to control rather than nurture. They think their HOA positions or law degrees or development connections make them untouchable right up until someone stands up and says no more. The white Range Rover doesn't patrol our road anymore. The orange survey flags don't mysteriously appear overnight. The false complaints and legal threats have ended. Mountain Vista Estates has become a genuinely pleasant neighbor, with many residents volunteering at the museum and attending our events. As I write this, Bradley is leading a tour group through the main exhibit. He's become an excellent educator, passionate about preservation, and determined to atone for his parents' crimes. He tells me he sleeps better at night, knowing he chose justice over family loyalty when it mattered most. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, but protecting what matters is worth any price. Uncle Ted knew that when he fought off developers for decades. I knew it when I refused to let Brenda steal his legacy. And thousands of visitors know it when they see history preserved, despite those who would destroy it for profit. The ranch endures. The museum thrives. And somewhere in federal prison, a former HOA president has 15 years to think about how her greed and corruption brought her down. She thought she was untouchable, thought her connections and schemes made her invincible, thought a simple antique appraiser would be an easy mark. She thought wrong. And that's the most satisfying ending of all. 5 years later, the museum has become one of Colorado's premier historical destinations. We've expanded to include a working blacksmith shop where visitors can watch demonstrations of traditional techniques and even try their hand at forging. The Education Center hosts over 10,000 students annually, and our summer camps are booked solid months in advance. Last month, something incredible happened. A package arrived with no return address, just a Washington, D.C. postmark. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a note that read, "Mr. Rivers, I believe this belongs with your collection." My grandmother was President Harrison's personal secretary and kept this record of his travels, including his visit to Colorado in 1889. The entries about the presidential carriage match your museum's artifact perfectly. Consider this: a donation from someone who believes in preserving truth. The journal authenticated the carriage beyond any doubt and included details about its construction that we'd never known. It was like Uncle Ted was still sending gifts from beyond, making sure his collection continued to grow and educate. But the universe saved its best irony for last week. A woman called asking if we had any job openings. She sounded desperate, explaining she'd just been released from federal prison and couldn't find work anywhere. Her name was Brenda Hawthorne. The ranch stands strong, the truth prevails, and history endures. Just like Uncle Ted always said it would.